Thank you, and it's very good always to be back home. And I'm very grateful to be here. I got very emotional when the publisher in New York reached me yesterday and said that we were already on the New York Times bestseller list. I got to tell you, a book with my mother on the cover. That is, however, I am not the young boy standing with her, because the publisher felt that I was not photogenic enough. So they had to find a young male model in Australia, Photoshop that in. It's amazing what they can do nowadays. It really is. Are the Schulmans here, Mark and Maureen Schulman? Or they just sent their cheesecake? They're not. I don't say. There is. I want to. So they're not here at the moment. All right. Well, I hope you'll get a book, but come for the book, stay for the cheesecake. I'm going to tell the Schulman story anecdote, if we can, in there, because when my mother was in the intensive care unit of a hospital here on the near north side, she didn't want to see anybody. But Mark, God bless him, came over with some cheesecake treats for the hospital staff and nurses, which are very thoughtful. And my mother insisted on seeing him. We go back with the Schulmans a long way to Eli Schulman's deli on Oak Street. And there's a scene in the book I describe. I believe it was my 14th birthday when my mother took me to eat at Eli's, the place for steak, and we didn't have enough money to pay the bill and had to run out, and she had to return. We've subsequently, made that all right with Mark. My mother actually returned the next day, as I recall. But in any event, she insisted on seeing Mark, and they had a lovely conversation. And when he left, Mark has 3 wonderful daughters, as some of you here may know. And my mother said, you worry about kids, you worry about boys especially, and you and Mark turned out just fine. And I said, well, he's really done amazing things with this father's cheesecake. I mean, they're even selling Eli's Chicago cheesecake in New York now. And my mother said, I don't mean any of that. I mean, you both have such beautiful families. So I wanted to read just one paragraph in the book, and then Allison and I will get to business, if that's all right, tell some stories. This book is, I think a lot of people know, actually grew out of the interest in tweets that I wound up sending from my mother's bedside in the intensive care unit. So this is a paragraph near the beginning of the book that begins with a tweet. Our children want to know if you're dead forever. I tell them yes, but I wonder about that too. Death makes life worthwhile. It gives each moment meaning. I hope I live to 150 and that our daughters can make it to at least 200. But death drives life. It frightens and inspires us. Do away with death and we'd have no reason to get out of bed or into it, grow, work, or love. Why would we do much of anything if we had the time for everything? It's the certainty of death that moves us to sing and write poems, find friends, and sail across oceans and skies. It's because we know that we don't have all the time in the world that we try to use the uncertain and unknowable time that we have to do something that endures. Death is sad, grim, unwelcome, and invaluable. It's why we try to make something of life. It's why we have children. All right, Allison, why don't we start the show? Okay. Thank you for letting me say that here in my hometown.
Oh yeah, no, that was fantastic. It's interesting. It's a question I had for you, which is, I don't think you set out to write a book about how to deal with death, no. But this is a tribute to your mother and a kind of memoir about your life with her and her life. And her life.
And one of the things you notice when you become a parent about having children is that you look at your child and they are suddenly all ages at once. I look at our 12-year-old, almost 12-year-old, she turns 12 on April 24, and, demonic possession is common at that age. But of course, the little girl that I see in front of me is my daughter, and so I see her when she's 2, I see her when she's 4. All of that is wrapped up, as no doubt when my mother and I were together in the ICU, she would look at me, who was hardly 12, and would see me as 6, would see me as 2, would see me as 30, you see, all ages at once. And one of the things that I regret, and I hope just at the personal level the book takes care of, is, my mother was not born a grandmother. And as I used to tell our daughters, she loved being their grandmother, but I would say, look, she wasn't put on this earth just to make you these epical breakfasts when you come to her apartment, just to to lay out. If they looked at something cross-eyed, it would be there on the breakfast table. My mother had a tough and interesting life. I mean, my God, she went out with Marshall Caifano. She was at the Villa Venice concert with the Rat Pack. She used to go without lunch so that I could get a baseball mitt. So I wanted them to know her as the entire person she was, because we don't become the people we are all at once.
True. Yeah, and when you started tweeting from your mother's bedside in the ICU, you said in some way you just wanted to share. She was so interesting and had so much wisdom that you had to, you felt kind of compelled to share that.
Well, I keep an active Twitter account, and I pass along some of the most interesting things that I might hear in a given day. And as you will know, as someone who interviews ostensibly interesting people professionally, often they're not the ones you hear interesting things from, right? Because they tend to be relentlessly on message. The most interesting things that you might hear in the course of the day are from children, from some fellow who's standing in front of you in the line at Starbucks, from something you might overhear on the Clark Street bus. So when I was with my mother in the ICU, the confines of our world sort of, in many ways, just shrank to those four walls, but it was hardly confining because she was just so funny and interesting. So when she would say things like, when she was struggling to sleep, she would say, maybe we ought to listen to opera. I always slept when I went. Or, at one point she said, children, they rely on you for everything, and then one day they decide you know absolutely nothing. Or one that's been quoted a lot, she said, honey, when I go, maybe there should be at least a little headline that says 3 Jewish husbands but no guilt.
She knew how to do it.
Yeah, and one that just stabbed me in the heart is when she looked up at one point and said, honey, you really ought to spend more time talking to people in their 80s because they have looked, she motioned, right across the street at death for more than a decade, and they know what's really important in life. And I just felt I had to share that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, she's such a character. One of the ones that jumped out to me was you said to her, and you tweeted this, "You'll never stop teaching me." And she replied, "Well, don't blame me for everything." Which is like the classic parent, right?
Absolutely true, yes, right? That's what parents do, yeah.
But a lot of the book is about what she did teach you, and this is something you didn't tweet, but that she says, I think in the ICU, which is, don't waste time trying to figure out how to avoid doing something good.
Yeah.
And I think this is when she's encouraging you to write a thank you note to someone, and you're like, they're not going to remember who I am. Because nobody knows who you are.
I was checking my email. I was visiting her, checking my email of an afternoon, and found out that somebody in the hierarchy of NPR had, in fact, as I recall, their mother had died. And I said, oh, this is a sad one. And she said, why don't you write a note right now while you're thinking of it? And I said, well, I don't really know this person. NPR is a big organization. And she said, oh, I bet he knows who you are. And I wrote the letter on the spot. And she said, don't waste time trying to figure out how to do the right thing.
Right.
And I mean, she was absolutely right. And I hope I've tried to do that since then, because what I've learned since I started doing that at her instruction, I mean, please, not everybody all at once, but I mean, if someone asked me to send a letter for a birthday, bar, bat mitzvah, anniversary, of course I'll do that. I love doing that, and I do write condolence notes to people that I don't know, but we're somehow in the same circle. And a number of times a year, people will come up to me and say, stop me in an airport and say, well, you don't know me, but you wrote a letter to my aunt, or my aunt died or something, and I walk off with a hug, which is really meant for my mother.
Not the very end of the book, but near the end, you kind of make a list of things like, words to live by from your mother. And so being kind is one of them, but one refers back maybe to that anecdote you told about Eli's and the kind of dine and dash you did, which is...
I didn't know there was a term of art for it, dine and dash.
Yeah.
We waited until the head waiter went one way, the waiter went another way, and we slip out. We left everything in our pockets there.
Right,
yeah.
and it was your mom who kind of cased the joint, who said, okay, he's busy, you know.
Yeah,
like,
which led me to believe that maybe she'd done that before, yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely true, yeah.
But I mean, I guess that is one of the things.
You know,
that,
maybe since the Schulmans aren't here, maybe this whole cheesecake thing is an elaborate prank, and they're finally getting their revenge. That just occurred to me. You know,
That's true.
Mark and Maureen, after all these years, you know.
You didn't leave us a tip that time.
Yeah, right. Well, we'll show him. We'll stiff him at the temple. Yeah.
That would be an elaborate. That would be the longest.
It would exactly. That would be many decades standing.
Of,
exactly.
Yeah. And speaking of bits, I mean, you refer to your mom as a kind of an old show.
Old showgirl, yeah.
Old showgirl, and it's true. I guess your family was a family of entertainers, even though it was your father, Ernest Simon, who was the comedian.
Well, I mean, that's
proper.
how. But you know, my mother worked at the Shapery Lounge, which. You see in the history books. I think it's a parking garage now, if I'm not mistaken, in back of Trump Tower. Whatever Mr. Trump probably refers to it, insists on referring to it as the parking garage behind Trump Tower. Puts a big sign on it. But in any event, she worked there. She worked at the Singapore, which was on Rush Street. She worked at the Redhead Club, which was owned by a woman named Patty Counts. She worked in and she was the secretary at Darcy Advertising in the Prudential Building, and she was, I do you know, pieces now for Sunday Morning on CBS, and every now and then I have to cut tracks at a local station, and of course CBS News is now in the Prudential Building. When I think of the history of that building, if you watch Mad Men, and she was a receptionist at Leo Burnett, which was an ad agency in the Hancock Building.
Oh.
She did a lot of different things. She was a model at the Chicago Auto Show year after year. She was a hand model, so she was the thumb on the Diet Right Save-A-Seal cap and the Royal Crown Cola Save-A-Seal cap. And I couldn't begin to remember the name of the blue toilet scrubber, but she was the hand who scrubbed the toilet, the hand that scrubbed the toilet. And unfortunately, the professional term for that kind of modeling is hand jobs. And there may be some people here tonight with whom I went to grammar school. You will recall it's tough to be in the 6th grade and have a mother who does hand jobs. Or at least it was for me. She did a lot of different things. And you know, there was forgive me for telling an anecdote from the book, but it was very important to her when she was in the ICU. There were two women that she had seen for years, every other Friday, a manicurist, and then a seamstress. And she had not been able to keep her appointment because she'd, after all, been in the intensive care unit. And she kept telling me, no, these women need the cash I give them to, I know what it's like to work for tips, like I have to do that. And she kept insisting. She tried to write a note, she couldn't. And she would say, well, you have to go and give them some money. And I would say, Mother, they understand. You're in the hospital. I've talked to both of them. And finally, I understood this was not a request. This was a commandment. And it was, in a sense, my mother's last commandment. And there was a woman as a seamstress over in an apartment building above a barber shop on the north side. And I saw her, and of course, both of them didn't want to take the money.
Yeah.
And I said to her, my mother says you have a little boy. And she says, yes, he's 6 years old, very cute. I show her pictures of my son. She shows me pictures of your daughters. And I said, my mother once had a little boy who was 6. And she did a lot of different jobs to give him the best life that she could. And here I am. And we both want you to have this.
Yeah.
And I like to think that in that moment, some of my mother's graciousness transferred itself. I didn't say, oh, come on, take it, or something more in tune with the times. Inspired by my mother, I tried to figure out the right combination of words that would get to her heart and let her take them, because she didn't want to take the money because she thought there was wrong to take money from Well, it wasn't for my mother at that point, for me, but that she hadn't done anything, so it was wrong. Don't do that.
Yeah.
And she also, I think, felt it was superstitious. No, I won't take it until your mother's out and I can talk to her. But I knew it was important to my mother, and to me for that matter, at that point, that she take it.
Did that happen?
Yeah.
Your mother, I mean, she did combine sort of the earthy and the gritty and the hard knock life with this graciousness and refinement. I mean, when you have that exchange about don't blame me, she's like, oh, what do I teach you anyway? And you said, well, you opened my eyes, and you're talking about art and the shared love of art you have. But there's a scene in the book that really struck me, and I wonder if it offers some insight into her life and the way she lived, and where you have, one of the pleasures is that you had all these like aunties and uncles, her friends who would hang out. And
Auntie Chris, Auntie Abba, Auntie Marion, Auntie Mama.
yeah, her
yes.
just this fantastic kind of like Greek course in a way of,
Auntie Abba was one of the women who instructed Playboy bunnies when how to do the bunny dip and that sort of thing.
Wow.
She was the first person I knew who had an English accent, and I think I write in the book that she was just about as British as Dolly Parton. She was from Baton Rouge, and she said, "But I don't want people up here asking me about corn liquor," And she used to get very upset at the Gloria Steinem line of criticism about the Playboy bunny costumes being restrictive and demeaning. She would say, they're not costumes, they're uniforms. And they wear some pretty ridiculous costumes at the Metropolitan Opera, too. Nice. I liked her a lot. And Auntie Chris had, I think I refer to her as Iowa Zoftig. She had been an exotic dancer when she first got to Chicago. She came from Iowa, from Council Bluffs in Iowa, and she was the family Republican. And she thought my mother was sweetly naive about men and Democrats. And in any event, she used to say, "Burn their bras," and then she would stand up all Iowa Zoftig. "My bra is my best friend." And I think I described the scene in there where Auntie Chris and Auntie Marion got arrested one night, right? Or at least apprehended at the Chicago Avenue Police Station.
That's right.
Right. They were taken. They had gone for a hamburger on Weld Street at Chances Are, and had made like the wrong turn on a street, and it turned out that neither of them had their driver's licenses, so they got taken into the Chicago Avenue Police Station, and they called my mother, I guess about 11 o'clock at night. I was in bed. In my little footy pajamas, and of course my mother had a child, so she was responsible, and they said, "We need someone to bail us out of jail." And so it was very exciting because they didn't have ATMs in those days, so my mother got out some reserve cash that she kept in the lingerie drawer, and we went out onto North State Parkway and hailed a cab, and I got to say, "Chicago Avenue Police Station, please," and step on it, which is extremely exciting for like an 11-year-old boy. And we got to the police station, and Auntie Marion, who was a lounge singer at the Club Alabama and the Redhead Club, we came in there. I was depressed by the fact that neither of them were shackled. I was really hoping, to see something out of a crime story. And in any event, she was perched on the desk of we walked in. This illustrates my mother's graciousness. And now my mother was the daughter of a cop, a cop here in Chicago, Francis, and Francis married to Francis with an E. Right. In any event, so we came into the police station, saw all the uniforms, and she went up to a lieutenant and called him captain, because she had learned you always address them by the rank above. And she said, "Good evening, Captain. I'm here to inquire about a couple of your guests." As if the Chicago Avenue Police Station was the Drake Hotel or something. So in any event, they knew exactly who she was talking about. And we went to this area, and Auntie Marion was perched on the edge of a desk, and she was singing, "Someday he'll come along, that man of mine." And she was wowing the crowd in the station house. So we, they didn't, as it turned out, as I recall, I don't think there was I don't think any money changed hands, at least not legally. Let's put it that way. And so I remember taking the cab back home, and Auntie Marion and Auntie Chris were both talking. "Oh, did you see? Oh, that private was, the sergeant was so cute. Oh, yeah, but the lieutenant had a better uniform." And I remember Auntie Chris said, "Oh, but they all wind up wearing those saggy golf shirts and slacks anyway." And they were just cackling and laughing, and I was on my mother's lap, and she just leaned into my ear and said, "I don't want you to always think that going to jail is this much fun."
Right. Well, the companion, or not the companions, but the parallels to the aunties were the uncles, this group of men that would hang out. And at one point, you asked your mother, you kind of clued in, I think, as a teenager, are they? I think you used the word fruits, but are they gay?
You did use that word.
Yeah, and your mother sat you down and said this beautiful thing about, not everyone can find a place in life, and these people have found a place here, and they may not have found one with their family, but we're their family. And when you're saying, like, she opened your eyes, I kind of wonder, she opened your eyes to the whole possibility of life, and I wonder if that had to do with the life she was leading, bailing her friends out of jail, or, that she kind of understood that there was more than the conventional path.
Oh, yes, I think so. I mean, she'd grown up in, her mother, Frances, or my mother's parents were Francis and Francis, one with an E, one with an I, the Chicago policeman, and Granny, my granny, Frances, was the maitre-d' at the Cape Cod room of the Drake Hotel, and I think she wanted to break out of what she considered to be a certain confining way to live, and for that matter, her mother had, but stayed in the marriage. Confining is probably the wrong word, but in any event, there was, my mother had spent a summer in Summerstock Theater, when it turned out to be in Elitch's Playhouse in Colorado. The same group of people, Grace Kelly was also in that. And I have seen the picture, and you would look at that picture and say, the two, forgive me, but this is the way they are in show business, the two prettiest faces in that lineup are the brunette, my mother, and Grace Kelly. And, and you wouldn't say one's going to wind up as a Shapery Adorable and the other's going to wind up as the Princess of Monaco. But then my mother lived longer than Princess Grace, didn't she? God bless her. But in any event, I think what she was very disappointed in me when I said to her, are they fruits? And I met, we used to call men like that confirmed bachelors or creative. There was Uncle Gene, Uncle Leo. And she's very disappointed in me. And I knew Uncle Jim. I knew some of the backstories to the extent that they had often come from smaller cities here in the Midwest and had come to Chicago to, I guess, feel freer, and much as anything else. And my mother understood about the way they lived. And I said to her, she said to me something like, well, if you really want to do something creative, you're going to meet a lot of people like them. And I said, but how can they really know about life when they're so different? And I was, forgive me for saying this in a temple, but I was a little shit, wasn't I? And
you
my
were
mother.
A teenager.
Pardon me, what? I was
a
a teenager. Well, as I said, I was, And my mother said, well, they know about love, they know about loss, and that's life. And she said, we're not their family, but we can give them something to eat, we can give them a good drink, we can give them a good time. And then she pushed herself away from the table and said, I think we're lucky to know them, don't you? She was right. Sorry.
She's a beautiful soul, really open and generous. And it strikes me, and you've talked about this, that I said earlier, hard knock life. I mean, she was someone who had a lot of struggles. Her mother committed suicide.
Mother committed suicide. I guess my mother was 21, her mother was 44 when she committed suicide,
And though she loved your father and you loved your father, he was an alcoholic and they had a tough life. And then she was alone, and so part of the unconventionality of her life had to do with how she could make a living to support you. And yet, so you could say, oh, tough life, keep you down, but she has this sort of, I always think of the title when I was reading about her, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, that she kind of understood the lightness of life.
I think you put your finger on something that I found that I've been saying in interviews, and it's the thought has crystallized to me as I've been doing the interviews. I hope it's in the book too. My mother had a real genius for forgetting. Her mother was a suicide. As she said, suicide puts a fly in your head. It keeps buzzing around. You never quite get it out. And there was a time I describe in the book when she seemed to attempt suicide over her relationship with a married man. And, her parents had sometimes been indifferent to her. She loved my father, but my father was, I think we can say fairly, a hopeless alcoholic, and she she said if it had been up to her, she would have stayed with my father, but she couldn't because she knew that that wouldn't be good for me. So she had to jump out of that marriage, and of course her mother wasn't there to support her. She married a wonderful guy who some people here might remember, Ralph Newman, and they were married very happily for 25 years. But then he was convicted of a federal crime, which he was convicted of backdating Richard Nixon's vice presidential papers, and which had a substantial impact on their life, to say the least. And I could go on, and the relationship with the married man. Any one of those things that happened to my mother, people would sometimes use as an excuse to immobilize their life, to paralyze themselves, to say, well, how can I go on? I mean, this has happened. My mother had a genius for forgetting. I mean, she didn't really forget. She knew what happened. Her recall was very good, but she had a genius for, at some point, not letting it affect her, and for just picking on and getting on with life, because she knew, well, she had a son. She knew she had to give a life to me, but I think she also understood that there was the key to happiness in that. She didn't absorb old insults. She didn't want people to feel guilty. She had this genius for just forgetting things and starting fresh. And I think that a suicide can be that fly in your head buzzing around. It's the final testament, I think, to her courage and her durability. The majesty of her soul, really, is the fact that she sucked every second out of life and lived to the age of 84.
And it's her genius that I think kind of made those, when you started tweeting, so appealing, right? It's just these like kind of little nuggets of wisdom and that lightness and sort of joy and pleasure, even at this moment that obviously was very tough and difficult for her. And I'm curious because when you started tweeting, I mean, you had, 1 million followers already, so you obviously were very comfortable and adept with social media, and it caught fire and people followed, and it just really kind of became this really big thing that you were doing this. And I don't know how to put this question exactly, but it seems like death is not something. This is a book about what it means for someone to die, someone that you've been close to, but death is not something we do very well in a way. We don't do it as a kind of communal thing very well, or at least not anymore, it seems, Do you? Yeah,
I mean, I obviously a lot of people have sought me out on this very subject. And, I don't know if I have anything thoroughly original to say about that, but I just, in the news business, we overuse that phrase universal a lot, a universal experience. But you know what? It really does apply to death. Let me say in a temple, with one prominent exception during the Easter season. But even then, he was returned, right? Okay, so, all right. All right, I want to be scrupulous about that. So far as that's what we have to say in the news business. So far as we know, it's a universal experience. And I think that, as I would sometimes say in some exasperation, all my mother did was die, and I don't think there's any reason not to talk about it. And also, I think that. And I think this happens to people who something happened at that when I first came to my mother's side, and we'd been out in Northern California. We'd rented a house in wine country, and my mother was going to join us. I mean, she'd been through several bouts of cancer. She'd been through radiation treatment in the recent past, but she was 84, and we wanted to treasure every possible scrap of time we could get. But she was going to join us there, and instead took a blood test, went into the hospital, and to quote Paul Harvey, and now you know the rest of the story. But when I came to her side, I didn't know that she would die there. But I think when that became apparent to both of us, really, she was looking through some kind of door or window. I think she could see the territory ahead in a way that leaves the rest of us, forgive me for sounding new agey, but very earthbound. I think she began to see something, what the next step was. And I think she really wanted to put on a good show for us, her family. I also think she became possessed of a kind of really great and hard-won wisdom in those last few days that may not have been possible a week before or a month before. But now that she was looking into the territory ahead and knew that that's where she was going, I think she understood some things in a different way, and she wanted to share them with me. I think it was like the final wisdom that she could give. I mean, something that we talked a little bit about my father, but my mother said that she had concluded that I was 16 when my father died, that my father had died because it was the last gift he could give us, that he loved us very much but understood he just couldn't stop drinking. And he understood that if it continued, and he couldn't stop, and he couldn't, I was growing older, and I would lose respect for him. And that he would bring us both down, and we would pity him, and he didn't want that. He wanted us to love him. And my mother concluded that he felt the best gift that he could give us was to depart. This was a stunning perception. And at some level, I had concluded that myself a few years ago. But it's something I thought I shared pretty much everything with my mother. I never could bring myself to say that to her.
You hadn't talked about it before.
Oh, we talked about my father all the
Right,
time.
but
and
not that
I had not
idea,
articulated
not that
that. No,
idea.
I'd mentioned it to my wife because I felt that would be too hurtful to say to my mother.
Yeah.
And I think that was something, maybe because she was looking into the territory ahead, I think it's something that she understood in a different way, and maybe saw it as the last great gift that my father gave us, and that's how she wanted me to see it too.
Well, before we go to questions, I want to ask you one more. And you know, as you said, death is a universal story. It's one that we will all participate in some ways.
Participate in.
In various ways.
Yeah.
But it's this book, which I really enjoyed, is also very Chicago. It's very specific. It's a Chicago story. I mean, your parents.
Oh, absolutely.
It's
yes.
so Chicago-centric, and this is not new terrain. You had written another memoir, Home and Away, which is about being a fan, and sort of that as a kind of pivot through which to talk about a lot of things.
And I wrote a Chicago political comedy too.
Right, Windy City.
Yeah.
But I guess, you know, I was reading it, and part of what was appealing too was just this glimpse of Chicago, the Chicago of your mother and father. And I wonder, is that Chicago gone? I mean, do you?
No, I wouldn't say it's gone. It's changed, and cities do.
Yeah.
And I think particularly vital, vibrant cities, which this is, change. Vital, vibrant cities, and I say that recognizing that there's terrible blight and terrible suffering in large swaths of the city. Having done some reporting and not enough reporting, to be sure, on in Englewood and other neighborhoods that have been particularly afflicted. But you know, I got here Tuesday night. I got here on election night.
Good timing.
Yes, I think I said on some interview show the next day I was able to get here just in time to cast my mother's vote for her. And
so some things never change.
By the way, I treasure the note I got from Senator Durbin when my mother died. He wrote a very nice note. My mother had met Senator Durbin on a couple of occasions, and in any event, he said wonderful things about my mother and had read some of the publicity about her death and tweet, and he said, and I hope to continue to earn her vote for many years to come. God bless him. And he's from Springfield. But I got here on election night, and I did a couple of TV shows, and I was watching the results, and of course came in very quickly. And I found myself very moved by both the speeches of Mayor Emanuel and Mr. Garcia. And when Mayor Emanuel said, you know, this was a mayoral race between the son of immigrants and an immigrant, and that's why Chicago is the greatest city in the world. And then when Mr. Garcia said, everything I am is Chicago. Sorry. I've got it. I'm sorry to do this. wife likes to say, you've met my wife, I think? No.
Briefly, yeah.
Some people, my wife is French, and she says, my husband cries when he talks about our children. So do I, but that's because I'm at home with them.
Well, let's open it up to some of other
yes.
Chicagoans and hear what they have to say.
My name is Lalita Khalida. I grew up in India and I came here 23 years back. And I would like to know whether you see any difference between the mothers and the kids' relationship when you were younger and now, and what did you see actually?
You mean difference between what they used to be and
Yeah,
now?
what your generations and now. Because my son always says, oh, no, when I say something, he said, Ma, you don't know anything. We don't do it like this in America, So he always said that.
Well,
just a fun question.
It's interesting. My wife and both of our children are immigrants. Our children were born in China. We came here, we brought them. Did you? Elise, who was our youngest, who is now 12, it's one of the sweetest moments of my life. We came through customs here.
Oh, nice.
And they were checking the paperwork. And in any event, it was the first time someone referred to us as Simon family. They called out Simon family. And we had Elise in our arms. And he said, so everything, all the paperwork, you actually become a citizen before when you adopt overseas an international program. You're a citizen when you get here. And the man in the Smokey the Bear hat at, I said customs, I guess that's TSA now or something, but in any event, he said, okay, Simon family, when you cross that line, and he pointed to a line that was about 20 feet behind him, your little girl is a citizen of the United States. And then he put his hand under Elise's chin and said, welcome home, sweetheart. Oh. I'm going to do it again. I hate to use the word universal, but I don't know as that's changed all that much. I mean, I used to think that my mother was not technologically savvy, when she didn't understand things about 4-track tapes. And I think, she probably used to complain that I was reading the Sun-Times too much, as opposed to the Elevated Tribune or something. And I guess I got to be careful with that these days. But in any event, I don't know as much of that. And every family, I think, has their own individual experience and their, and their reflection that they could give on that. And I don't know. I haven't observed that it's dramatically different. I'll find out, though. Of course, we have a 12-year-old and an 8-year-old.
Your interviewing approach has me enthralled most of the time. And so
She said
I have a
most
question.
of the time, didn't she? Yeah.
I wasn't going to say.
No, go ahead.
That didn't come out right.
That's all right, don't worry.
I meant all the time.
Yeah, no, it's all right, yeah.
So I've wondered how you got to be such a great interviewer and conversationalist. It just flows so beautifully, and your sense of humor comes through, your emotions. I just think you're the greatest.
Nice of you to say that. Thank you. That's very nice. Thank you. I think my wife will tell you I'm not that great a conversationalist. I think there are people here tonight who will tell you I'm not that great a conversationalist. If there is, I have a story I tell in the book. There might be a man. There's a man that some people here might remember named Lar America First Daly. He ran for every office that was ever. Does he have is there a plaque supporting Lar America First Daily back there?
That's a great story.
He ran for every office that there was. He had an Uncle Sam hat. He would campaign in a tall, towering Uncle Sam hat and often an Uncle Sam suit. And I was running an underground magazine with a massive circulation of 100 or something, and we set out these very self-important letters to everybody on the ballot, inviting candidates to meet with our editorial board to compete for our endorsement. And incredibly enough, Lar America First Daily replied. So he came to our one-bedroom apartment on the north side and wearing the Uncle Sam hat. And I forget what the so-called news part of the interview was like. But in any event, my mother had the grace when it was done to say, well, Mr. Daley, I know you have another campaign appearance to get to, which is probably not true, but can we offer you a drink for your trouble? And in fact, he had a couple, Scotch rocks, as I recall. And he was talking about his life and the glory days. He was in the bar stool manufacturing business and talked about how they used to have a kind of business plan going with the police about if you tell me what bookie parlor you're going to raid next, I'll give you 50 cents for every stool you sell them when they have to replace their furniture. That's a business plan. But he was talking about how the money had been rolling in, and he said to my mother, but the glory days are always when we're younger. Isn't that right, Mrs. Simon? And my mother said, you were so right, Mr. Daley. And he said, I've got, I forget how many kids, 5 kids I think he had. He said, and I worry about what they might hear and people making fun of me, but I say, hey, you can't let that get you down. You can't let people make fun of you. Making fun of you prevents you from doing what you really think is important. He said, I tell this to my kids, and I'll tell it to yours too. Right here, Mrs. Simon, you got to do what you believe in. And I said to my mother and I talked about that in the ICU, and I said, I was trying to be like a cynical, sophisticated journalist I saw in the movies and be cynical about him. My mother saw that there was some majesty to Lar America First Daley, that here is a man who had dedicated his life to public service in his own way as much as any much more hallowed name that we could mention in U.S. history. And my mother saw that. My mother saw the real person standing there. I saw a kind of cheap, cynical stereotype. And I hope that at least every now and then I remind myself of that I'm interviewing, because of my mother, that I'm interviewing a real person, and I don't begin with a lot of preconceptions, and I give them a chance to make their own best case. Didn't work with Bill Cosby so well.
Mentors. Did you have any particular mentors or broadcasters, news people that you...
John Calloway. John Calloway, who hired me here at Channel 11, and alas, it was 3 years ago I wound up giving the eulogy at his funeral. He was a wonderful man, absolutely wonderful man, and taught me a lot. And this didn't make it into the book, but I have a section with some of my mother's letters. My mother sent extraordinary letters. When she had to have her cat pass into another dimension, I find it hard to say, had to have her cat put down, my mother wrote a thank you note to the veterinarian. And I remember when I saw that, I could imagine my mother saying, well, nobody becomes a veterinarian because they want to do that to an animal. This must be very hard for veterinarians to do. But it just, in the editing process, we just didn't have room for it. But there was a wonderful exchange of letters between my mother and John Calloway, which was just terrific. And they were both exceptional human beings.
Did your mother know what that you were tweeting, and what did she think about your doing that? Did she understand anything about the limitations of that form of communication?
My mother knew I was tweeting, and I'm not certain she understood what tweeting was. And for that matter, I think I would remind us that tweeting is different now than it was a year and a half ago. We've had 2 candidates for president announce, I think, in the past few days on Twitter. Pope Francis, God bless him. Does that sound patronizing for me to say God bless him? I apologize if it is. Pope Francis has, I follow Pope Francis in all ways, but certainly on Twitter. And so it's changed substantially. I didn't have a lot of time to read messages, but occasionally I would, and I would bring them in because it's important for me to understand that my mother wouldn't be in her bed and would say something wise, and I would go, hang on, Mother, let me get that down, let me send a tweet. That was hardly the case, but I think as anybody who has been with a loved one through a terminal illness, there are hours of tedium. And I would wait until I would get up, take a bathroom break, go to the inevitable Starbucks downstairs, and my mind would be reeling, and some thoughts would kind of take shape, and that's when I would tweet out something that my mother said. So every now and then, if I saw one of the messages that came back, I would say to my mother, look, someone in Ireland says he's praying for you. Or someone in Tasmania, I remember, someone in Tasmania says that you're making him laugh. And she said, oh, that's nice. But my mother was not a shrinking violet. And I think she bloomed often under a certain amount of attention. And I think this has been a week and a half ago now, and the New York Times asked me to write a piece in the Sunday opinion section about what had happened. And I wound up saying, I suppose that I could have kept all of this to myself, but there's a reason why I'm in broadcasting and not espionage. And I just temperamentally don't keep the most marvelous things I discover to myself.
Scott, when I was in my 20s, my mother passed away. And when she passed, she was already dead, but I felt like she was speaking to me, and she said some very wonderful words to me. And in your book, you mention how you do believe that there's an afterlife.
Yes.
And I wondered if you have had echoes of your mother's voice, or felt her presence in any way
Sure.
since she's died.
And I realize that people whose rationality I respect can find more plausible explanations for all of this. But yes, I recently came across a marvelous quote from Oscar Wilde, by the way, who said, I don't like brute force, but neither do I approve of brute reasonableness. And I think there's something to that. My mother would have been 85 on August 31st. She died on July 29th. We came back to Chicago as a family for her birthday on August 31st, and we were at a restaurant and ordered. My mother's drink of choice was a Rob Roy, and so we didn't drink it, but the Rob Roy was delivered to the table, kind of like, I guess you set out the cup for Elijah, except in this case, Elijah's cup had a Rob Roy in it with the maraschino cherry, and our 8-year-old, who I then guessed was 7, looked over and said, look, there's a heart in Grand-Mère's drink. And there was a heart in the foam. And just a few weeks ago, I am not someone who remembers my dreams, but I got up. I get up very early in the morning to write and work on outside projects and stuff. And I got up and vividly remembered something during the night. And I told my wife when she got up that my dream was we were in Los Angeles for me to do Oprah. And that I had left the table with my wife and I had gone to the bar to get 2 glasses of white wine, to show you what kind of epical drinkers we are. And sitting at the bar was my mother. And I said, Mother, what are you doing here? And kissed hello and everything. And she said, well, I'm here to meet Oprah. I knew you were coming here and I wanted to surprise you. And I said, oh, this is wonderful. How did you get here? And she said, oh, I took a rainbow. And I said, what was that like? And she said, oh, they've gotten rid of all the service. And that just was my mother to a T. And when I woke up my wife, I told her that, and she said, darling, that wasn't a dream, that was a visit. And look, I used to have some very nice conversations with Christopher Hitchens about this sort of stuff, and I loved Christopher Hitchens. And I used to wind up saying to him, look, the fact is we're both wrong. The fact is we're going to find out that it's something that neither of us ever thought about, but I don't care if I'm right. I do need something that gets me through the dark nights of life. And I have no problem saying, I just cannot live thinking that I will never again see the people I love. And I just don't think that happens. And if I'm wrong, I'll find out and I'll deal with it. But that's what I tell myself now. And and I think in those stages when my mother was looking through the window at what was next, she felt that way too. So maybe I have a little something more to go on.
I'm wondering if the book, like if you had already had the idea for the book or if it came out of the tweets, and then like had you always wanted to write a book about your mom?
It's interesting. No, it hadn't occurred to me. I wrote this book, Home and Away, and it was published by Hyperion, which is a division of Disney, and the head of Hyperion then was a man named Bob Miller. And Bob Miller had met my mother the night that my wife and I got engaged at the Frontera Grill. And Bob was totally besotted by my mother. And he said to me at one point, you know, you ought to write a book about your mother someday. So I went on to write other books. Bob, in the meantime, became the head of Workman Publishing. And now he's the head of Flatiron Macmillan. Flatiron, his own imprint at Macmillan. I went to Random House. I strayed from Bob Miller, but he had left Hyperion, and that's just strictly business. And the tweets got the attention, and there were some immediate interest from a lot of people in the publishing industry that I might do some kind of book. And my wife and I purposely didn't pay it any attention for about 3 months. My mother died in July, and we said, let's get through the summer and think about this. And I think by that point we thought, no, this is something that I want to do. My mother had a hell of a life. This is a good story. And more to the point, it was on, my children are mostly going to grow up without knowing my mother. And I wanted to have something that they could get to know my mother, and not just remember the grandmother who made these epical breakfasts for them, but to know the showgirl and the mother and the woman who sometimes felt scared and lonely and in her depths swallowed pills and yet came back roaring in her own way. I wanted them to know that person too, and so that's when I said, yes, maybe we should do this. And Bob Miller is now the head of Flatiron, his own imprint at Macmillan. And in any event, I'm going to sound incredibly new agey, but he was one of the first. And when he called after my mother died, it was just a condolence call. Your mother was great. It wasn't. But ultimately, of course, they submitted a bid, and I've said to my wife, I almost don't care what the other ones are. Bob Miller said I should write a book about my mother, and I'm going to write it for you. My mother used to refer to Bob as that lovely man. She said that about a lot of people. She said that about a lovely, and he sent me a very nice email yesterday when the word came out that we had debuted on the New York Times bestseller list, and he said. I bet your mother is looking down on this, and I hope she thinks I'm a lovely man. Sorry. I hope the cheesecake got here.